There is a quiet moment that changes everything for an empath. It does not come with noise, conflict, or dramatic confrontation. It comes in stillness. A realization forms, slow but undeniable, that something about the connection they have always honored is slowly draining them. Not loudly, not violently, but consistently, and that consistency becomes the evidence they can no longer ignore. Empaths are often raised in environments where emotional awareness becomes a survival skill. They learn to read tone before words, tension before expression, silence before meaning. Over time, this sensitivity becomes their strength, but also their burden, because when the environment is unstable, critical, dismissive, or emotionally inconsistent, the empath adapts by overfunctioning. They listen more, they give more, they absorb more, and they question themselves more. Distance for an empath is not rebellion. It is not coldness. It is not a lack of love. It is often the final stage of clarity. At first, the empath tries everything else. They try understanding. They try patience. They try communication that is softer, clearer, more accommodating. They try to be the bridge between chaos and calm. But something important begins to happen during this process. They start noticing patterns, not isolated moments, but repeated cycles. Moments where their boundaries are dismissed. Moments where their feelings are minimized. Moments where their role is expected, not appreciated. This is where psychology begins to shift. An empath does not suddenly decide to distance themselves. They slowly arrive at the realization that staying connected in the same way is costing them their internal stability. And once this awareness becomes conscious, it cannot be undone. The empath begins to see that their emotional labor has been normalized, that their capacity to understand has been taken as permission to tolerate, that their willingness to forgive has been interpreted as a lack of limits. And this is where a subtle but powerful transformation begins. They stop explaining themselves repeatedly. They stop chasing resolution that never truly resolves. They stop trying to fix dynamics that require more than one person to change. This does not happen overnight. It is a gradual withdrawal of energy. First, they respond less. Then they share less. Then they initiate less. And eventually, they step back. From the outside, it may look like distance, but from the inside, it feels like relief mixed with grief. Because the empath is not just stepping away from people, they are stepping away from roles they have carried for years. The peacekeeper, the emotional translator, the one who absorbs tension to keep everything stable. And letting go of that identity is not easy. There is guilt. There is doubt. There is a voice that says, maybe you are overreacting, maybe you are being too sensitive, maybe you should try harder. But there is another voice, quieter but stronger, that says this is not sustainable. And over time, that voice becomes the one they trust. Psychologically, this shift is significant. It represents a movement from external validation to internal alignment. The empath is no longer measuring their worth by how much they can endure. They are beginning to measure it by how well they can protect their peace. This is not selfishness, this is self-preservation. Many empaths struggle with the idea of distance because they associate closeness with loyalty. They believe that staying connected, no matter the cost, is proof of love. But what they begin to understand is that true connection cannot require the abandonment of self. If being present in a relationship consistently leads to anxiety, emotional exhaustion, or a sense of invisibility, then distance becomes not just an option, but a necessity. There is also a neurological component to this. Empaths often have heightened mirror neuron activity, which means they are more sensitive to the emotional states of others. In a healthy environment, this leads to deep connection and understanding. But in a dysfunctional environment, it leads to chronic overstimulation. The empath is constantly processing not just their own emotions, but the unspoken tension, frustration, or negativity around them. Over time, this creates a state of emotional fatigue. Distance, then, is not just psychological, it is biological regulation. It allows the nervous system to reset. It reduces the constant input of conflicting emotional signals. It creates space for clarity. And in that space, something important happens. The empath begins to rediscover themselves. Without the constant need to monitor others, they start noticing their own preferences, their own needs, their own emotional rhythms. They begin to ask themselves what they actually feel, not just what others feel. This is a profound shift, because for a long time, their identity was shaped by their responsiveness. Who they were was tied to how well they could support others. But now, they are learning to exist without that constant external focus. And that can feel unfamiliar. There may be moments of loneliness, moments where the absence of chaos feels strange, moments where they question if they have done the right thing. But gradually those moments are replaced by a growing sense of stability. They begin to experience what it feels like to not be in a constant state of emotional alertness, to not anticipate the next conflict, to not manage the moods of others. This is where healing begins. It is not dramatic, it is not immediate, but it is real. The empath starts setting boundaries that are not negotiable, not explained endlessly, not justified repeatedly, simply maintained. They learn that boundaries are not about controlling others. They are about defining what they will accept. And perhaps most importantly, they learn that distance does not erase love. It redefines it. They can still care about their family. They can still wish them well, but they no longer have to sacrifice their well-being to maintain the connection. This is a mature form of emotional independence. It is not rooted in anger. It is rooted in clarity. And clarity changes everything. Because once the empath understands the dynamics at play, they stop personalizing behaviors that were never about them. They see patterns that existed long before they were aware of them. They recognize that their role in the system was learned, not chosen. And that means it can be unlearned. This is where empowerment begins. Not in confrontation, but in quiet consistency. The empath does not need to prove their decision. They do not need validation from those who may never understand. They simply need to remain aligned with what they know to be true. And that truth is this: peace is not something to be earned through endurance. It is something to be protected through choice. Distance is one of those choices. It is not a rejection of others. It is a commitment to self. And for an empath, that commitment is one of the most difficult and most powerful decisions they will ever make, because it requires them to trust themselves in a way they may never have before. To trust that their experience is valid, that their needs are legitimate, that their boundaries are necessary. And once that trust is established, everything changes. They no longer seek permission to take care of themselves. They no longer wait for circumstances to improve before allowing themselves to feel better. They create their own stability. And in doing so, they redefine what connection means. Not something that drains them, but something that supports them. Not something that requires constant adjustment, but something that allows authenticity. This is the evolution of the empath. From absorber to observer, from fixer to chooser, from overgiver to self-respecting individual. And that evolution often begins with distance. Not as an escape, but as a strategy. Not as avoidance, but as awareness in action. Because sometimes the most powerful thing an empath can do is step back. Not to disconnect from love, but to reconnect with themselves. And in that reconnection, they find something they may have been missing for a long time. Peace that does not depend on anyone else's behavior. Clarity that does not require external agreement. Strength that is not loud but steady. This is not the end of their story. It is the beginning of a new chapter. And what matters is not just connection. It is balance. It is self-respect. It is the quiet understanding that love should not cost you your sense of self. And once an empath truly understands that, distance is no longer a loss. It becomes a form of freedom. There is another layer to this journey that does not get talked about enough. After the empath creates distance, after the silence replaces the noise, after the nervous system begins to settle, something deeper begins to surface. It is not just relief, it is awareness that was previously buried under constant emotional demand. The empath starts to recognize how much of their life was built around adaptation, not authentic expression, but strategic behavior. They were not simply being kind or supportive. They were calibrating themselves in real time, adjusting tone, timing, words, even facial expressions to maintain emotional equilibrium in their environment. That level of awareness is not accidental. It is learned. It is reinforced over years of subtle feedback. When the empath expresses a need and is ignored, they learn to suppress it. When they show emotion and are criticized, they learn to soften it. When they try to set a boundary and are met with resistance, they learn to negotiate it away. Over time, this creates a pattern where the empath becomes highly attuned to others but increasingly disconnected from themselves. Distance interrupts that pattern. Without the constant need to adjust, the empath begins to notice how automatic their responses had become. They might catch themselves rehearsing conversations that are no longer happening. They might feel the urge to explain themselves even when no one is asking. They might anticipate criticism in situations where none exists. This is the residue of long-term emotional conditioning. Psychologically, this is where the real work begins, because stepping away from the environment does not immediately erase the patterns learned within it. The empath has to actively unlearn behaviors that once served a purpose but are no longer necessary. This requires patience. There is a tendency to expect immediate clarity once distance is created. But clarity comes in layers. First comes the physical separation, then comes the emotional decompression. And only after that does the deeper cognitive and behavioral recalibration begin. The empath starts questioning beliefs that were once unquestioned. Beliefs like, it is my responsibility to keep everyone comfortable. Beliefs like, if I do not respond immediately, I am being disrespectful. Beliefs like, saying no will damage the relationship. These beliefs are not random. They are the internalized rules of the system the empath grew up in. And breaking those rules can feel uncomfortable even when they are no longer valid. This is where internal conflict shows up. Part of the empath knows that distance was necessary, that the previous dynamic was unsustainable, but another part still holds on to the old framework, the old expectations, the old definitions of what it means to be a good son, daughter, sibling, or family member. This creates moments of doubt, moments where they consider reconnecting in the same way, moments where they wonder if they should just tolerate things again to restore familiarity. But familiarity is not the same as safety, and this distinction becomes clearer over time. The empath begins to understand that just because something feels familiar does not mean it is healthy. In fact, many unhealthy dynamics feel comfortable simply because they are known. Distance creates the opportunity to redefine what comfort actually means. Not the absence of conflict at any cost, but the presence of mutual respect. Not constant emotional management, but balanced interaction. Not silent endurance, but honest expression. This redefinition changes how the empath evaluates relationships. They begin to notice where their energy is reciprocated and where it is simply expected. They become more aware of how they feel after interactions, not just during them. This is a critical shift, because for a long time, the empath prioritized how others felt over how they themselves felt. Now, they are beginning to include their own experience in the equation. And that changes their decisions. They may choose to maintain limited contact rather than complete disconnection. They may set clear boundaries around topics that are no longer open for discussion. They may decide that certain behaviors are no longer acceptable, regardless of who is displaying them. This is not about punishment, it is about alignment. The empath is aligning their external interactions with their internal standards. And that alignment requires consistency. There will be moments where the old dynamics attempt to reassert themselves. Family systems often resist change, especially when one member shifts their role. The empath may be met with confusion, resistance, or even criticism. They may be told that they have changed, that they are being distant, that they are no longer the same person. And in many ways that is true. But change is not inherently negative. It depends on the direction. The empath is not becoming less caring. They are becoming more selective with how they express that care. They are not losing empathy. They are learning to apply it in a way that includes themselves. This is a more sustainable form of empathy, one that does not lead to burnout, one that does not require self-abandonment, one that recognizes that understanding someone does not obligate you to tolerate everything they do. This distinction is essential. Because empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect, and self-neglect over time leads to resentment, exhaustion, and disconnection. Distance prevents that outcome. It creates space for the empath to rebuild their internal foundation, to develop a sense of self that is not entirely dependent on external feedback, to establish values that guide their behavior rather than reacting to the expectations of others. This process also brings up grief, not just for the distance itself, but for the realization that certain relationships may never function in the way the empath had hoped. There is a mourning of what could have been, a recognition that despite effort, understanding, and patience, the dynamic did not change in the way it needed to. This grief is valid, and it is part of the healing process. Because letting go of unrealistic expectations allows the empath to engage with reality more clearly. They no longer wait for a moment of perfect understanding that may never come. They no longer base their decisions on potential rather than actual behavior. They begin to accept people as they are, while also deciding what level of access those people have to their life. This is emotional maturity. It is not about changing others. It is about choosing how you respond to them. And distance is one of those responses. It is a boundary expressed through behavior rather than words. It communicates without explanation that something has shifted. And over time, that shift becomes the new normal. The empath starts to build a life that is not centered around managing family dynamics. They invest energy into relationships that are balanced. They pursue interests that were previously neglected. They create routines that support their well-being. This is where growth becomes visible, not in dramatic declarations, but in consistent choices. Choosing rest over obligation, choosing honesty over avoidance, choosing self-respect over approval. These choices accumulate, and as they do, the empath's identity becomes more defined. They are no longer just the person who understands everyone else. They are someone who understands themselves. This self-understanding leads to confidence. Not loud or performative confidence, but a quiet certainty. A certainty that they can trust their own judgment, that they can make decisions based on their own needs without excessive guilt, that they can navigate relationships without losing themselves. This is the long-term impact of choosing distance. It is not isolation, it is differentiation. The ability to remain connected to others without being consumed by their emotional states. The ability to care without overextending. The ability to be present without being responsible for everything. And this ability transforms how the empath experiences life. They are no longer in a constant state of vigilance. They are not scanning for tension or anticipating conflict at every moment. They can relax. They can be. And that simplicity is powerful. Because for a long time, their experience was anything but simple. It was layered with unspoken expectations, emotional complexity, and constant adjustment. Now there is space. Space to think clearly, space to feel fully, space to respond intentionally. This space is not empty. It is productive. It allows for creativity, for exploration, for genuine connection. It allows the empath to engage with the world from a place of stability rather than survival. And that changes everything. Because when you are no longer operating in survival mode, your perspective shifts. You begin to see opportunities where you once saw obstacles. You begin to form relationships based on compatibility rather than obligation. You begin to make choices that reflect your values rather than your fears. This is empowerment. Not in the sense of control over others, but in the sense of control over your own life. And that control is grounded in awareness. Awareness of what you need, awareness of what you will accept, awareness of what you will no longer tolerate.